This is Kyone Wolf from Good Day, New Hampshire. I'm live on the scene of the Pumpkin Fest riots here in Keene. We've seen thousands of young men marauding through this ordinarily peaceful agricultural festival, and I've managed to persuade one of them to talk to me on camera. What's your name, young man?
Am I on TV for real, bro?
Yes, we're live right now.
Eagles suck! Eagles suck!
Could you please stop
Eagles
that?
suck.
By the way, do you mean the Philadelphia Eagles or the band?
I'm not sure, bro. I'm like totally wasted. We did mad brewskis on the drive up. Craig and Luke were like blacking out, bro. We needed some caffeine for real, so we started crushing pizzas and shotgunning for locos, dude. But when we got here, the chicks were like totally ratchet, bro.
I'm not entirely sure I understood all that, but our cameras did capture you and your friends throwing bottles at each other and overturning that car over there and setting it on fire.
I know, right? Pumpkin Fest rules, brah. Crack open the natty light and let's some jack-o'-lanterns.
But why take something this innocent and lay waste to it?
Because, brah, our traditional male roles have been rendered meaningless in a post-industrial economy. Women now hold 51.4% of managerial and professional jobs. They make up 54% of all accountants and hold about half of all banking and insurance jobs. Men dominate just 2 of the 15 job categories projected to grow the most over the next decade: janitor and computer engineer. As a society, we have failed to make our expectations for men change to fit a swiftly mutating labor economy, bruh.
So, because of that, you're rioting at the Pumpkin Fest?
Really, bro? Hey, Brad and Jason are busting up a Chuck E. Cheese. I gotta go. Wait up, bros!
There you have it. Today on the show, experimental poet, Christian book, implants poetry in the DNA of microorganisms. Michael Sean Winter analyzes the battle between the Pope and his bishops. And yes, we'll have a real report on the madness in Keene, New Hampshire. And now, the man who wore sweatpants before sweatpants were cool, Colin McEnroe.
That does sound very bad. Actually, there really was. I mean, we're not making this up. There actually was this weekend a lot of rioting in something called Pumpkin Fest in Keene, New Hampshire, where typically the goal there is to, I think they try to set the Guinness Book of World Records record every year for the most jack-o'-lanterns. And so they have like 38,000 illuminated jack-o'-lanterns. But for some reason or other, this time it attracted a lot of bros. Not that all bros are violent, but a lot of violent bros. And they did. They had cars burning and bottle throwing and many arrests and rubber bullets and tear gas fired and all that kind of stuff. So we'll try to get to the bottom of that and fail. Also, a little bit later in the show, Michael Sean Winter, who's our go-to guy, columnist for the National Catholic Reporter, our go-to guy on all matters affecting the Vatican. So we'll talk to him about the synod, which you've probably picked up a little bit. This is a bishop's synod on family, to which Pope Francis tried to introduce some of his newer ideas with only limited success. Anyway, all of that is to come. This interview is one that I've been very excited about for a very long time, but also a little bit nervous about. I don't know if I'm up to the task. This is going to challenge my brain a little bit. But I discovered Christian Book at the time we were doing, you may remember, I don't know, it was like 6 months ago, 9 months ago, we did a show about Dada. And in the course of researching that show and just looking at various people, I discovered Christian Book and his work. And I especially discovered his Twitter feed, which, I mean, I really do mean this. If I could follow only one Twitter feed of anybody on Twitter, I would follow Christian Book. And it's almost impossible to describe what the Twitter feed is like, but there are a lot of allusions to a mysterious and ominous sounding they, and then links to this amazing stuff that you don't find anywhere else. So you read things like, they plan to build igloos of ice on worlds without atmospheres. They plan to search for alien artifacts in the solar system. They let you sacrifice your city to the asteroid demigods. They create imaginary maps of cities that do not exist. They insist that they have found a dragon particle of alien life in the stratosphere. And all of these are linked to stories that as I say, I don't think I would find any other way. So this the omnivorousness and the eclecticism of his intellect is irresistible. But there's so much more, too. He's the author of several books of poetry, including Crystallography and Eunoia. I hope I'm saying that right. And he's created artificial languages for the television shows Amazon and Earth, the Final Conflict. He currently teaches at the University of Calgary. I have no idea where he is now because from his Twitter feed, I know he's also very peripatetic. So Christian Book, first of all, where are you checking in from?
I'm checking in from the University of Calgary in Calgary, Alberta, Canada.
Right where you're supposed to be. Okay, that's great news. You know, there's so much we want to talk to you about, but I think maybe the thing to start with is the project alluded to in the introduction, Xenotext. This is your effort of many, many years now to encode poetry using the DNA of a microorganism to encode poetry that will show up within a microorganism. I'm sure I'm doing a very poor job of explaining it. Maybe for our listeners, you can do a better job.
Sure, no problem. I've been working for the last 15 years on a single project that involves me writing a very short poem, and then through a process of encipherment, I translate this poem into a sequence of genetic nucleotides. And then, with the assistance of a laboratory, I actually build this gene in the lab and then implant it into a bacterium, replacing part of its genome with my poem. So the organism, in effect, becomes the living embodiment of my text. Now, lots of artists and scientists have actually encoded information into the DNA of organisms, so doing this particular activity is not very difficult. However, I've written my poem in such a way that the organism can actually read the gene sequence, and in response, it interprets it as a set of instructions. It reads my poem, and in response, it builds a protein whose sequence of amino acids is itself yet another completely different encipherment of a totally different poem. I am, in effect, genetically engineering a bacterium, so it becomes not only an archive for storing my poem, but it also becomes a machine for writing a poem in response. And the punchline to this particular crazy project is that the host organism that I have selected for this project is an unkillable bacterium called Deinococcus radiodurans, an organism that can survive in all kinds of hostile environments. You can scorch it, wither it, freeze it, and it does not die. It can repair its own DNA so quickly that it does not mutate or evolve. It has not changed very much since it first appeared upon the planet Earth. And it can survive in the open vacuum of outer space. It can even survive 1,000 times the dosage of gamma radiation that might instantly kill a human being. By putting my poem into this bacterium, I am in effect trying to write a book that might conceivably outlast terrestrial civilization, and the poem might in fact be on the planet Earth when the sun explodes. I am in effect trying to write a book that lasts forever.
All right.
That is the project in a nutshell.
As one of the participants in our intro would have said, that is awesome, bro. We should say something about this particular bacterium, because in choosing that one to try to rewrite the DNA structure and get it to produce these proteins, you're choosing the hardest one, right? This was a relatively easy, I don't know, easy is the wrong word, but it was a relatively doable thing with a more malleable bacterium like E. coli. But this organism that you're talking about right now, for all of the reasons that it's so durable, is also incredibly difficult to mess with.
That's true. As it turns out, it is very hard to actually engineer this particular bacterium. It took me about 3 years of concerted effort to actually get the entire project to work in E. coli as a kind of test run to demonstrate the proof of the concept so that I could gain access to the engineering of the extremophile organism, the very difficult bacterium to kill. I have yet to get it to work in that new context, but I'm still making an effort because I've only had 1 or 2 opportunities to try. But I have managed to get the project to work in E. coli. I suppose that if I had simply promised to get a bacterium, any bacterium, to store a poem and write one in response, I would probably be one of the most famous poets of my generation on the planet. But I promised too much. I promised to put the chimp on the moon, not just into orbit. And as a consequence, I really have condemned myself to a very long-term project trying to make it work.
We should say that, although you have the assistance of scientists in carrying out the final stage of this, you've really had to learn microbiology, biochemistry, and a whole bunch of other disciplines, not ordinarily the province of poets, correct?
Yes, that's true. The scientists with which I collaborate, they can provide support by building things for me and by testing things for me, but they do not design anything and they do not solve problems. I have to be able to do that all myself. So I've had to teach myself a sufficient amount of molecular biochemistry so that I could design a viable gene sequence, do the simulations on supercomputers in order to see what the proteins might be like, to be able to do the proteomic design and engineering. I've had to do all that myself, and I've had to troubleshoot the outcomes myself. I've had to come up with hypotheses for why they fail and figure out how to redesign these constructs so that they can work. But the laboratories, they're very helpful. They often provide me with some advice about the outcomes. And fortunately, I've managed to acquire a sufficient number of skills, albeit very dilettantishly, to do this specific project.
When you work with laboratories about this, are they warm to and in understanding of the literary task that's involved here? I mean, these are two worlds that don't necessarily intersect or overlap that much, the world of really high-tech science and the world of poetry. How much of a conversation are you managing to have with the people on the technical side about the artistic side?
Well, I've had numerous conversations with many peers around the world, and invariably the initial reaction is a bit skeptical, but after a conversation, the scientists generally warm to me. I have been able to impress some proteomic engineers and biochemists with my expertise. Now, I cannot claim to have a sufficient amount of expertise to be a doctorate in genetic engineering, but I do have, I think, a sufficient amount of discursive immersion in that milieu so that I can carry on conversations with my colleagues and present myself as a credible collaborator. I mean, that's part of the exercise, I think, artistically, is to actually master these sets of skills that are otherwise outside the catechism of our literary training as poets.
Well, let's talk about that, too. Part of this, as I understand it, is your desire really to expand poetry and art and literature beyond the restrictions that exist now, to see, in fact, if poetry and art can flourish in environments that wouldn't typically accommodate them. Is there a better, more concise, more articulate than I just gave answer to the why of this? Why devote 15 years of your life to this particular project?
Well, I think trying to become the best 21st century poet that I can be. We live in a milieu that's extremely technological and scientifically inflected. Science is probably the most important cultural activity that we now do as a species, perhaps second only to the economy. And undoubtedly, science is going to have a tremendous impact upon our own cultural experience in the 21st century. And yet poets have not historically been very immersed in the vocabulary and discourse of science. They haven't brought science into the world of poetry. For example, there is no epic poem, say, about the moon landing, and yet that's probably the most epic adventure that any life form has undertaken on this planet in the entire history of the planet. And you can bet that if the ancient Greeks had rowed a trireme to the moon, there would be a 12-volume epic poem about that experience. But there isn't one yet in the modern era, and I think in part it's because the technological experience of modern life has not found its way into poetry. Poets have not gone to enough effort, I think, to address science and its cultural impact.
But it seems like the other part of this is to somehow or other break the paradigm of, I mean, what people think of as poetry is, I'm a poet, I'm sitting here, I get inspiration from God knows where, words come into my head, I write those words down on paper, I change those words that I've written down on paper, I eventually come up with something that I'm going to call a poem, I then read it at a reading, I get it published in a collection or in a magazine. So that's what a poem, that's what poetry is. It seems to me the other thing that you're trying to do is snap that paradigm a little bit and say, well, no, a poem could come from another place. It could even be manufactured within a bacterium based on something else, some other kind of genetic information that the bacterium got. I mean, that poetry could flow from some other place than the one I just described.
Sure, exactly. I'm not the kind of poet who writes about his personal experience, expressing anecdotes about his daily life. I'm the kind of poet who is curious about the limit cases of language, trying to figure out what language is capable of doing. I always joke that language is some kind of alien superorganism, and I'm working in Area 51 trying to reverse engineer it for human purposes. I'm trying to build anti-grav machines out of words, and I think that's one of the jobs that a poet can do is to figure out different ways of using language so that we alter our perceptions about the world, we learn something new about how we express ourselves, and we discover something unusual about language. I'm trying to make discoveries, I think. I think probably at heart I might be a scientist, and this is the only way in which I can express that scientific interest is through these bizarre poetic exercises.
Well, let's talk about another experiment with language that's a little bit more accessible to the average person, and that's Eunoia. I hope I'm saying that correctly. This is a 5 chapters long poem. Each chapter uses only one of the vowels. So the first chapter is only letters that contain the vowel, only words that contain the vowel A. This has become an extraordinarily popular volume of poetry. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Sure. Well, Eunoia, spelled E-U-N-O-I-A, is the shortest word in English to contain all 5 vowels, and the word quite literally means beautiful thinking. It was a word coined by Aristotle to describe the state of mind that you need to be in if you want to make a friend. And I think it's a very beautiful metaphor for poetry. The book is written in 5 chapters, each of which tells a story that's meaningful and euphonic, sounds very beautiful when read aloud, and yet does so using only one of the 5 vowels. So in the first chapter, the only vowel that appears is the letter A. I can only use words like abracadabra, mat, cat, bat, banana. And yet I still manage to say something intelligible with this restriction. And then in the second chapter, I use only E, and I do this for each of the subsequent vowels. The book became a national bestseller in Canada when it was published, and went on then to win the Griffin Poetry Prize, which is probably the most lucrative poetry prize that you can win for a single volume of poetry. And it's gone on to be an international sensation, a best-selling book in other countries around the world. It's certainly the book that has made my reputation as a poet. And I think that based upon its success, I've done my best to try and upstage it by working, of course, on something like the Xenotext. Eunoia is, I think, a book that's designed to showcase how language can thrive and endure even under the most extreme duresses. I mean, it should be impossible, really, to say something meaningful with any poetic merit if you restrict yourself to one vowel. And yet the book has got humor and wit and some sublime moments of poetic merit. It's an exercise in showcasing the potential of language to express a sentiment even under these kinds of censorships and constraints.
We're kind of speed reading through Christian Book right now, and when we finish here, I sort of encourage you to follow him on Twitter, although when I do this, all kinds of friends of mine and my coworkers are going to realize that all these really cool things I keep sharing with them, I'm stealing from Christian Book's Twitter feed. I'm going to seem I'm going to seem less eclectic and interesting once people realize how derivative of Christian Book I am. But let's use our final minutes, as we're kind of speed reading through you, to talk a little bit about the notion of conceptual literature, which is sort of in the conversation we're having right now. This is an aesthetic movement, which, as I understand it anyway, it's not maybe a perfect mirror image of what conceptual art is as opposed to traditional art, but kind of close, right?
Sure.
A way to do literature in a way that, once again, kind of unyokes it from the established thinking about what literature is.
Sure. Conceptual literature is the first avant-garde poetic movement of the 21st century, and I'm one of its co-founders with Kenneth Goldsmith and Darren Wursler. Back in the late 90s, the three of us had a conversation about the future of poetry, trying to imagine what we might do in order to make an important contribution to the art world. And we decided that there were 4 limit cases of writing that needed to be discussed in more detail at the dawn of the next millennium. And they included, among others, these 4 valences, I guess. One being the unreadable text of illegible writing, the other being the mannerist text of really constrained writing, or the kind of randomized work of robotic writing done entirely by machines, and finally the ready-made writing of plagiarized text. And Kenneth Goldsmith, for example, became quite famous for really popularizing the ability of poets to simply steal texts and reframe them as new works of literary merit. In fact, he gained some notoriety for actually being allowed to address Barack Obama at the White House for a big poetry reading there, and all he read was traffic reports to the President of the United States, doing so as though it were a work of poetry, as though it were a poetry reading. These are the kinds of works that my gang does, I guess, that we try to explore areas of writing that might otherwise be dismissed as not writing, as something that is unpoetic, uncreative, that lacks authorship. And we're doing our best, I think, to show its potential to be poetic, to be perceived as something literary and artistic.
We will, I think, post a link to something you did about what you call conceptualism in the wild, which is sort of back to those traffic reports. In other words, there's sort of a lot of things, and they're not all verbal, too. I mean, I'll just quote from your piece. Nanex is a company that monitors robotic trading of stocks, in which algorithms flood various indexes with thousands of transactions per millisecond, only to vanish. Each flash crash caused by such a device creates a unique visual poem whose robotic writing notates the fibrillations in value. More than 50% of internet activity is now non-human, implying perhaps that robots have already started to outpace our own digitized exchanges of text. And then you link to this thing. It's really, it's very fascinating in a very Dadaist way that there are these words, but also these sort of visual poems or visual images that are suggestive of those words or the math behind those words, inviting us to think of a whole new concept of poetry. I don't think I did that justice. But
no, you did a perfect explanation of it. The mapping of those trades by robots, the visualizations of those trade activity really do look like artworks. They look like something beautiful that we could easily imagine being exhibited in galleries. And yet the side effect of something that's completely unartistic, something that has no relationship to literature or the art world, but it could be repackaged or reframed as though it were art. And I think it's very fascinating to imagine that these robots might actually have some sort of cultural impact that we can barely understand. I think that's why I'm interested in that particular scenario that you've described.
All right, robots and germs, all part of the future of art and literature. Christian Book, so great to have you on. We have another conceptual artist named Jonathan Keats on a regular basis. We clearly have to give the two of you your own show.
I admire Jonathan very much.
Yeah, he's on with us a lot. We'll have you on together to talk about God knows what. But thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very kindly. I appreciate the support, Colin.
All right, as we go out, actually, we're going to hear Christian Book. I think he is, I have to look this up now. Oh, he's reading a Hugo Ball. Back when we did the Dadaist show, I also discovered some of these audios of Hugo Ball. So this is Totenklage by Hugo Ball.
Zangagago, Bragaga, Zuzaga Glugim, Wama, Zuzaga, Zuzago, Zuzaga Lama, Bishigi, Bishigo, Bishigi, Bishigi, Bishigo, Bishigo, go, 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 go,
All right, we're having a little bit of trouble reaching one of our guests here. Let me tell you a little bit more about what's going on. Also, let me just say that apropos, Michael Sean is here. Apropos of the previous segment, if you're confused about anything that you heard, first of all, I would not blame you. You can email me, Colin, COLIN, at WNPR.org. We do like to find people who have really, really unusual ideas, really unusual visions for the world, and Christian Book is certainly one of those. But we'd love to hear what you think about that. And then go to WNPR.org later today. We will post as much supporting material as we possibly can to help you understand everything that you've heard, assuming that you're having any trouble at all. And you can follow Christian Book on Twitter. His name is actually spelled B-O-K, so it's Christian, just like Christian, B-O-K. And he really is worth following on Twitter, even though it will wreck certain people's impressions of my own eclecticism, because I'm stealing it all from him. Joining us right now, Michael Sean Winters is a columnist for the National Catholic Reporter. He's our go-to guy whenever there's something going on in the news of, well, what are we doing? Oh, we lost him again. All right. So I'm going to put him on hold for a second. Let me just also tell you, in just a little while, we're going to go to Jared Goodell. Jared Goodell kind of emerged over the weekend as kind of a viral celebrity. And when I say that, I mean that he was for some kind of, I guess it's sort of like a local public access station. He was covering the Pumpkin Fest in Keene, New Hampshire. And suddenly Keene, New Hampshire went crazy. Not really exactly right at the Pumpkin Fest, not at Ground Zero or Pumpkin Zero or whatever, but surrounding him, there was suddenly real, no other word for it, rioting. He began to cover that. The organizers of the Pumpkin Fest tried to stop him from covering that. And the whole thing, as I say, kind of went viral. And the Pumpkin Fest has turned into kind of an interesting conversation. There are people who are sort of saying, well, that kind of thing, when it's done by young white males, doesn't really get covered the same way or talked about the same way or maybe even responded to by the police the same way as a much more peaceful style of demonstration in a place like Ferguson does. So it's part of a much larger conversation. We're going to go to Jared right now, actually, and we'll juggle Michael Sean Winter down to the bottom. This is why I like the Monday Scramble. I have to be challenged. So Jared Goodell, I was just describing a few seconds ago the video of you that's kind of gone a little bit viral, but I'll let you tell the story yourself. You were there covering and spending, I think as you said, about 80% of your coverage day covering this very lovely idea, this Pumpkin Fest in Keene, New Hampshire, which attempts to, I think, set a record for the most lighted jack-o'-lanterns, like 38,000 jack-o'-lanterns or something. So first of all, tell us about Pumpkin Fest and then tell us what happened.
Well, first of all, good afternoon, and thank you for having me on. The Pumpkin Festival is something that has been happening in Keene, New Hampshire for 24 years now. This is the 24th year. And basically, it's a day where Keene is transformed into a festival atmosphere. The streets are lined with scaffolding. On those scaffolding is carved jack-o'-lanterns from people locally and from people who travel from around New England, around the country, and quite honestly, from around the world. And as you mentioned just a few moments ago, Keene holds the Guinness World Record for the most lit jack-o'-lanterns, that number 30,581. We took that record back from Boston in 2013. And that's really what the Pumpkin Festival is all about. It's carved, lit jack-o'-lanterns.
Unfortunately, in the midst of all that this year, Keene unintentionally started to set the Guinness record for white male bros showing up drunk and for no particular reason that I can see or that I can understand anyway, starting to engage in acts of mayhem. So maybe where you were standing, it was still sort of nice jack-o'-lanterns, but all around you, maybe you can kind of give us a sense of what was going on all around you.
Well, first let me just say that this has been something that has been happening at the Pumpkin Festival for many years now, and over the past few years it has really been coming to a head. I think this year it climaxed. These parties, these large gatherings have been happening increasingly in the past 3 years. In fact, it's even led many people who live in the downtown area of Keene to request that the city council not license the Pumpkin Festival to happen because their property becomes damaged, because beer cans are strewn about their yards. But this year, it really, like I said, it climaxed. The parties were bigger. There was more alcohol. They started earlier. In fact, parties started as early as Thursday, leading into Saturday. Things got bigger this year and led to fires being set in the streets. It led to police officers being hurt. It led to SWAT teams being flown in via helicopter. This year was big. It was huge.
I mean, there was not only SWAT teams flown in by helicopter, but at least by some of the reporting by the Boston Globe and others, there was tear gas deployed and maybe even rubber bullets as well, correct?
Yes. From what I understand, the state police, New Hampshire State Police, were using paintball-like guns to shoot what are called pepper balls into the crowds. Pepper spray was also used quite a bit to help disperse the crowds. State police helicopters were also brought in when it got dark to shine light on the large crowds so that police on the ground could see. And they also had a loudspeaker ordering crowds to disperse or be arrested.
There's a sort of there are many ironies in all this. One of them is that at the time of Ferguson, there was a lot of coverage of the fact. I don't know whether you've picked up on this yet or not, Jared. I would imagine your last 48 hours have been pretty chaotic. But there was a lot of coverage of smaller towns that had acquired heavily armored military vehicles that could be used for crowd control, as was the case in Ferguson. And one of the ones that was constantly cited was Keene, and two different comedians, John Oliver and Stephen Colbert, brought up Keene as a comedic example of a place that absolutely needed an armored vehicle because, after all, they have this pumpkin fest, which seemed like a very funny thing to be bringing up back in September, but in fact, or August or whenever that was. But in fact, what they didn't understand was, as you were saying, that there actually has been some. Not that it would necessarily warrant the use of a military, heavily armor-clad vehicle, but there has been some unrest building up around Pumpkin Fest. Well, yeah, go ahead.
Well, you're correct that that the city of Keene did acquire what is known as a Bearcat armored vehicle from the Department of Homeland Security, and that was done, I believe, 2 years ago now. And as you mentioned, Pumpkin Festival riots were cited. The unrest at Pumpkin Festival was cited as a reason for needing that armored vehicle. A lot of people in Keene. Keene is a home of the Free Keene Libertarian Movement, the Free Staters, they're also known as. And a lot of people spoke out against Keene acquiring this vehicle because they felt it militarized the police. Now, to the best of my knowledge, the Bearcat was not used this past Saturday night at Pumpkin Festival. Again, that's to the best of my knowledge. It may have in fact been used, but again, I do not have any reports that the Bearcat was brought out.
Yeah, no, I haven't had any reports, read any reports about that either. So you were there. I mean, one of the things that kind of went a little bit viral around this was the fact that you were there trying to do your broadcast. The organizer of the Pumpkin Fest was essentially trying to silence you, maybe even take your mic away from you, threatening to pull the plug on you. What was going on there?
Well, first let me just say that this broadcast was happening on a local access television station, a cable local access television station. I was an independent producer. I have grown up in Keene. The Pumpkin Festival started a year before I was born. So I really wanted to bring the magic of Pumpkin Festival into the homes of viewers in the Monadnock region, in the Keene area, on Cheshire TV. And so I invested several thousand of my own dollars into this broadcast. I hired professional people to help co-host, to help produce. And I asked Ruth Sterling, I told her about what my plans were. I asked her for a location within the footprint. She granted that. But there was never any reciprocal agreement that, you give me a space on the footprint and I will talk all good about the Pumpkin Festival. Now, as I just mentioned a few moments ago, the Pumpkin Festival, near and dear to my heart. Look, I've grown up in Keene. I've been going to the Keene Pumpkin Festival for quite a few years now, for my entire life, really. And I talked about good. I would say over the 8 hours that we were on the air, 90% of what we discussed was the good. We were talking to costumed kids on the street. We were talking to people who came from across the United States. We were asking people how many pumpkins they brought and how long they had been coming to the Pumpkin Festival. But as anyone would do, we also talked about the bad. And again, this was 10% of our entire 8-hour broadcast was the bad. We talked about the riots in the past. We talked about many Keene residents in the downtown area not wanting Pumpkin Festival to happen because it disrupts their neighborhoods in such a great way because of the college riots. We talked about those things, and at the time when Ruth Sterling stormed onto the hot TV set, that live TV set, I was reading a statement from Keene State College President Ann Huot. This was the first statement that had come out of the college, and it had just come into my phone. I was literally reading it off of my phone at that point. And Ruth Sterling stormed onto the set. She stood next to the camera operator on the specific camera that was capturing me. I threw to a break as soon as I was done reading the statement because I could see that Ruth was mad at me. She was giving me the cutthroat gesture. So I walked over to her, and she told me that she was going to pull the plug on the broadcast. and that I needed to stop talking about the bad things and start talking about the good things because I was, quote, alarming people and inciting people. I had a producer in my ear telling me we were going back on air in 15 seconds. So I told Ruth, we're going back on air in 15 seconds. Please don't make a fool of yourself on live TV. As you see, we went live. And the rest is history.
Yeah, and
Ruth.
we will share that video at WNPR.org. We'll be tweeting it also. You did show a lot of calm under pressure for a young man, Jared Goodell. Let me just ask you one last question, and this isn't a question that you necessarily have to have an answer to, but I mean, I think people look at something like this and they think, well, I mean, it really does seem like a pretty innocent undertaking, Pumpkin Fest. I mean, it's almost ludicrously agrarian and innocent sounding, and yet this other thing happened, and what really was pretty bad with at least one overturned car, and as we say, this huge deployment of police and rioting and bottle throwing. I don't know, has any explanation that makes any sense to you been floated by you as to why such a thing would happen in an environment like that one?
Are you asking about the riots?
Yeah, the riots. The riots. Why do you think there was rioting at Pumpkin Fest?
Look, the truth is, when you get 5,000 inebriated college-age students together who have been drinking for 72 hours straight, when you get people into large crowds, there is bound to be some craziness that happens, and I think that is what happened. I think when the police get involved, that can sometimes escalate the situation. I'm not saying that the Keene Police or the New Hampshire State Police or any other agencies escalated the situation. However, I feel that sometimes when the police put shin guards on, when they put hard hats on, when they have long rifles out slung over their shoulders, that can sometimes that can escalate the situation. And again, I'm not saying that is what happened here because I was not down witnessing this stuff happen live, but I suspect that there's a possibility that played a role. But certainly, Keene State College students who invited, 5, 10 friends apiece up and who were drinking all weekend long, certainly I think are the people to blame for the rioting and for the destruction that occurred on Pumpkin Festival.
All right, you can learn more about Jared Goodell. His Twitter feed is Jared Goodell. That's 2 O's, 1 D, and 2 L's. We're naming him our Millennial of the Week. I'm always picking on millennials here. He's a great millennial. He's got a lot of he showed a lot of calm under pressure in this situation. All right, so we're going to come back with the previously promised analysis of what went on in the Synod of Bishops with Michael Sean Winter.
Another poor child is gone. What the hell is going on?
If Pope Francis really wants to change the positions of all these bishops, he's overlooking an important tool: campaign commercials. Come on, let your mind run wild. Today's show was produced by Betsy Kaplan and me. Our interns are Jackie Filson and Josh Nalea. Greg Hill appeared in the intro and tweets for us at WNPR Colin. The part of Bill Curry was played by Ben Affleck. For show pages, articles, and the Faith Middleton Show staff's recipe for pumpkin souffle cooked on an overturned car on fire, visit our website, WNPR.org. On tomorrow's show, we review this year's campaign commercials. And now, back to Colin.
All right, Michael Sean Winters writes for the National Catholic Reporter, which is an independent news source on Catholic affairs. You may have been aware, in the midst of all the other news of the last few days, of a debate going on within the highest reaches of the Church. It's a debate about the family. It's a debate about gay Catholics and gay marriage. It's a debate about how divorced Catholics are treated within the Church and within the liturgy of the Church. So with that, I'm going to hand off the baton. And Michael Sean Winters, just in a nutshell, what was the Synod of Bishops debating, and what did they wind up saying about it?
Well, this is the first of 2 synods, and the job of this synod was to address the state of the question. And the question is, how does the Church care for families in the context of evangelization, of what the Church is about, of spreading on the faith and passing it on generation to generation? As you mentioned, the hot button issues were those families that are irregular, so divorced and remarried families, gay families. These were the two that seemed to be the most contentious issues there. They did not come to any, real agreement in terms of what has to be done, but that's actually the task of the next synod. What caused some controversy was midway through this last synod, which was 2 weeks. So halfway through, there was an interim draft released that was pretty far ahead of where most of the bishops were, a little bit too progressive, and so they dialed some of that back. But clearly, the majority of the Synod Fathers are looking for some different avenues for pursuing pastoral, what we call pastoral practice. How do you actually care for families, and especially those families that are in these situations that are irregular?
Now, there's a couple of different ways you can look at something like this, and the National Catholic Reporter, in its reporting and its analysis of this, has tended to emphasize the idea that there is change. It's done within the rubric of something called graduality. These conversations are going on. They're meant to go on. Not everybody in the church, not every bishop, obviously, from every part of the world is on the same page, but there's a really good process in place for having this conversation and for moving forward. And so that's a good thing, and it's sort of really nothing to fear or be worried about. Now, the more dire way of looking at this is that it really did seem at times, and feel free to disabuse me of this, but I'll just sort of give you the dire, cynical way of looking at this. It really did seem like quite a bit of push and pull going on between Pope Francis, who obviously does have a pretty progressive view of some of these questions, and some of the people who have more traditional points of view. And it seemed as though there were a locking of horns between Pope Francis and Cardinal Raymond Burke, who's the head of the Vatican Supreme Court, or he was the Vatican Supreme Court. He appears to have been cashiered, maybe as a result of the fact that he really did push back against that first document, saying it's just way too progressive, it's way too revolutionary, it's way ahead of where we are as a church, and that the more dire way of viewing this is a church having a very hard conversation right now, in which there's a pretty high level of discomfort, particularly among the traditionalists, looking at what Pope Francis wants to do. I don't know. Respond to that a little bit.
I think you're absolutely right. This is a conversation the church is having as a family, and I think these are conversations that every family actually has with their teenagers, which is, how do we hold out for our children? What we want them to aspire to? How do we reprimand them when we think they err? How do we protect them from influences that will harm them? And yet all the while making sure that we know that they love them. And so, my colleague Tom Rees said, the balance here is the love of a mother with the necessity of being a teacher. And how do you balance those two? This is not uncommon for, again, anybody who has teenagers. So I think this is what they're trying to get their head around. I would point out, though, I think there are some distinctions between the people who are suspicious of what we can call the Pope Francis agenda. Certainly you have, especially from Africa, bishops from very traditional societies who are very worried. Those traditional families are under pressure for socioeconomic reasons and a host of other things, and they think if you pull one brick out of the wall, the whole wall is going to fall apart. That is somewhat different from Cardinal Burke, who is, from the United States originally, and he just strikes me as a Jansenist. He's one of these, people who just thinks, takes a certain pride in telling other people to suck it up, and that the more the gospel is presented in this kind of tough love, that's better for the church. I don't see it that way. I think it's pretty obvious Pope Francis doesn't see that way. And as you noted, Cardinal Burke is about to be cashiered out of his job of influence and sent to a very minuscule job. Although that, just so you know, that decision was made before the synod.
It seemed as though Pope Francis, in his response to all this, was trying to take a healing tone and a tone of equilibrium, and he sort of seemed to, if I understood everything that I read, gently chide the traditionalists, but also gently chide people who I would have assumed were pretty much on the same page with him, right? That that you can go too far in either way. You can go too far with your zeal for reform. You can go too far in your adherence to tradition. Was that just kind of a way of calming the waters at the end? He seemed to be treating both sides kind of equally, even though everybody knows he's on one side rather than the other.
Oh, well, that's his job. I mean, the job of the Pope is to ensure the unity of the church and the fidelity to the tradition. So, and he had this great line that was actually not in the published text where he said, the Pope is the guarantor of the fidelity and unity of the church. Well, I'm the Pope, and here I am. He often goes off text. And yes, I think it's clear where his sympathies lie, but his job as Pope is to bring everyone together, or at least everyone that you possibly can bring together. At the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, every document was voted on, and none of them passed unanimously. But you wanted to get it where you had, votes of, 1,685 to 12.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is what is the challenge looking toward next year's synod. How do we formulate a response to the situation of families that's going to gather those kind of overwhelming majorities? So whatever his personal sympathies, I think his job is to keep everyone together. The only other thing I would add there is this is an astute old Jesuit. And what when he called out both sides, clearly what he was calling them out for is, look, you don't come to this issue with an agenda. You come to this to listen to each other, and together we're going to figure out how to move forward. And I think that's the problem on both sides is you see these kind of external agendas being put on like checklists. And that's not going to be conducive to a fruitful dialogue and bringing the church together.
The hazard in all this, and I'm sure it's a hazard that worries you, Michael Sean Winters, is that, here's the Roman Catholic Church is in many ways one of the great engines for conversations about social justice, for conversations about poverty and inequality, and it's an engine that can drive a global conversation about these topics. And so it seems kind of a shame in some ways to see the church getting stuck in a highly publicized conflict about sex roles and about gender. That seems like maybe not even the place that Pope Francis ultimately wants to take the church.
I think that's somewhat true, except as the message from the Synod Fathers made clear, they're acutely aware of the socioeconomic pressures on the family. That if you're trying to raise a family in excruciating poverty, that's very hard to do. And I think they're also very suspicious of the way we in the affluent West have this consumer society where if you want to sell a new product, you say, well, new. And that is not conducive to the formation of consciences capable of saying I do in a marriage ceremony and meaning what the church means, that, hey, this is forever. So I wouldn't overstate the distinction between what we call the kind of pelvic theology issues and the social justice issues. There's clearly a link. I mean, there's reams of social science data that will show you that families that are intact, where the children are living with both biological parents, do a lot better, and broken families incline toward poverty and other social dysfunction. So I wouldn't want to draw too clean of a line between those.
I mean, we only have about a minute left. I don't know whether you saw, there was a Frank Bruni piece in the New York Times a week or two ago, just sort of saying, well, for a lot of Catholics, they feel like some of those pelvic issues are deal breakers in ways that almost nothing else is. He had one theologian saying, could I go and take communion and if I were in favor of the death penalty, even though the teaching of the church is very different. Of course I could, and nobody would even ask a question about it. And that in some ways, these issues, I love the term pelvic theology, they just feel like they're bigger deal breakers than they need to be. Unfortunately, you only have about 45 seconds to speak to that.
Unfortunately, this is the case. We have to get away from this, which is, Mia Farrow put out a tweet, come join the Episcopalians. We have gay clergy. We have, female clergy, all this kind of stuff. And as a Catholic, I would say, yes, but you don't have the apostolic succession. You don't have the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, the things that I really care about. So you're on to something. And I think that's part of Francis's bigger agenda is, church teaching is great, but it has to serve the gospel. Moral theology is great, but it has to serve the gospel. And as pastors, how do you preach the gospel in the beginning of the 21st century to families who are facing challenges that were not faced in previous times?
All right. Michael Sean Winters, so great to talk to you. I'm going to get email from Episcopalians who do think they have an apostolic succession. But I'll handle those. I'll blame it all on you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great, Colin. Take care.
All right. Michael Sean Winters from the National Catholic Reporter. We would never dream of talking about an issue like that one if we couldn't get Michael Sean aboard with us. Thanks to everybody who helped out with today's show. Tomorrow's show is campaign commercials. Really, you want more of them, right? You want to hear them on the radio. You want people talking about them. We've got some of our advertising gurus plus crusading journalists, Matt Kaufman, coming in to talk about the state of campaign commercials, the local races, the ones you've been seeing cluttering your own TV feed.
And I'm just going to light the candle. And there you have it, my first jack-o'-lantern. Hey, what's
This one is for pay inequality for women. Close the gender gap, yeah!